Okay, so you guys all turned in your assignment 102s. I just handed out assignment 103, so you can kind of see how this trend works, where we turn in one, then you get the next one, that sort of thing. It's not due for a while. It's due October 1st, so we still have a little bit of time. I guess it's a week. Is that a week from today? No, so you don't have that much time. It's only a week from today, but that's okay. It's very doable. You're going to be doing an 11 by 17 poster to showcase your graphic design skills. You will do a lecture series. You can use the lecture series that was last semester if you want. You can make up your own lecture series. The people who are coming to lecture can be dead. It doesn't really matter. This is not so much about the content. It's more about the arrangement, the hierarchy. Graphically, are you creating something that would inspire people to go to the lecture series? Does that make sense? Right? So how do you lay it out? What's the hierarchy? Is the information clear? Are you targeting? Are you getting to the correct audience? Are people responding at that sort of thing? We will start today in Adobe InDesign, which is the primary layout software. You as architecture designer students through your careers, whether you choose to practice architecture or not, will end up using InDesign a lot. I wouldn't be surprised if you converted to using InDesign for your English and history papers down the road. Not necessarily to type the papers, but in terms of layout and that sort of thing. If you've ever worked, trying to, let's say you're in Daniel's history class, you're trying to write a paper and you're trying to put some images in the paper. Very common thing to do in the world of architecture. We love images. We'd rather put images in than actually write anything. So lots of images is always good, but if you're doing it in Word and you've tried to arrange the pictures, they can get really cranky about how the text flows around the images and that sort of thing. InDesign solves all of those problems really nicely. So I wouldn't be surprised if you start living in the world of InDesign in terms of laying out your work and that sort of thing. Certainly when you get to architecture studios and you're doing the big presentation boards and that sort of thing, there's no substitute for InDesign. So we will spend a fair amount of time working on InDesign. InDesign, I'm coming, hold on. InDesign is not the sort of thing that we'll cover really quickly and then never do the rest of the semester. I start InDesign relatively early in the semester, and then we will continue going back to it throughout the rest of the semester. Your final project for this class is a portfolio of your work. It can be just your work in this class, but a lot of times people include work outside of the class. We'll talk at great length about creating that portfolio, the design, the layout, and that sort of thing of that particular portfolio, which will be done in InDesign. And you'll learn quite a bit about kind of that process and really using InDesign. The hope being that you'll have a very good working portfolio by the time you exit this class. So that's assignment for the end, but you will start on that probably next week, just in terms of getting that ball rolling, and then we'll revisit it several times throughout the semester. You had a question?
Regarding assignment 103,
yes.
Information about the lectures, where do we find that?
You know, I'd have to go back and look. Ace Club usually has a poster that's been up. I will try to see if I can find what last year's lecture was. I think it's on. It used to always go on the website, but Daniels hasn't been updating the website as frequently anymore. If you can't find anything, then you can make up architects that you think would be interesting to have come. My guess is it does not have to be realistic whatsoever. So if you're interested and you would like to hear Tom Main, Frank Gehry, and Frank Lloyd Wright, and I.M. Pei, or whatever your group of architects would be, you can choose them as your architects. It doesn't necessarily have to be a realistic grouping of architects. Like I said, the architects could be dead, and that would be fine. So you can call this your ideal lecture series if you want. You could also borrow a lecture series from, say, Berkeley's lecture series or MIT's lecture series. All the big schools have a lecture series each semester, so chances are you'd be able to borrow it from one of them if you wanted something like that. We will talk today a little bit about the design process, and in that I will talk about the separation of the graphic design realm from the creation of the content. And the importance of being able to get the content or recognizing your responsibility to create the content in the first place. There's kind of two different things. So that's assignment 103. There will be time in class as we're going. So for example, today you're just barely starting in InDesign. You'll get familiar with things. But the exercise, 111, which we'll do, which will be a CD cover or an album cover of your favorite artist. which is always kind of interesting to see what people pick as their artist. Anyway, that is kind of your first introduction to InDesign, how it works, referencing files, and that sort of thing. But each day, this exercise won't take that long, and you'll have some time to work on your poster. So keep that in your mind in the back, thinking about it. So today, let's talk about graphic design. I call this Graphic Design 1. There will be a Graphic Design 2 lecture as well that talks a little bit more about layouts, margins, flow lines, and how do you create a unified body of work with hierarchy and that sort of thing. Today's kind of the early introduction. And I think that an early introduction to graphic design is kind of the same. I could cut out the graphic part and just say introduction to design to some extent, because I think this applies whether you're in the architectural realm, whether you're in the graphic realm, or any other design field for that matter. I think a lot of these principles hold true. Basically, the function of design is to communicate some kind of a message, some kind of an idea through a juxtaposition of elements. And that in graphic design lingo would be words and pictures. In architectural, it would be architectural elements like walls, floors, buildings, sections, that sort of thing. In the graphic design realm, it's the visual synthesis of your thoughts, right? How do you bring those together such that you can impart that series of thoughts on someone else? So we have a variety of graphic design objectives. My guess is if I didn't put this slide up and I said, give me some graphic design objectives, you could come up with a fair number of these off of that list. They're pretty intuitive. So you're trying to guide people. You might be trying to persuade somebody. You might be trying to encourage somebody to do something. Obviously, it's a communication of information. You might be trying to motivate, educate. These are all things that should be relatively obvious in terms of what the function of this would be. And then interspersed through all these slides, I'm going to show you a bunch of examples. I try to focus a fair amount on kind of portfolio-like examples so that you start seeing that kind of information and how you might present a clean, clear portfolio of work. A lot of times it doesn't even matter. Like, for example, this is not in English, but it doesn't really matter that it's not in English. The graphic design reads through. It's very clean. You have one side with one picture with a little bit of light text on it. You have another side that's very clear, single column, single body of text, lines up with the 6 images below. So there's just a certain cohesiveness to that as a body of work. We flip the page to a different page. Same concept with the big picture, light text, paragraph on the same. So there's a certain consistency to that and how it's done. So first off, you kind of have to establish the function of your design. What is the purpose, basically, of what you're trying to do? In the graphic design realm, it could be an invitation, it could be a poster, it could be a book. It's something, it could be a website. It's something that is more print, word, picture combination. Could be video, I guess. What's your primary objective of this particular design project? Who is your intended audience? Who are you trying to harness? So if we were talking about your lecture series poster, right? Your primary objective would be probably to raise awareness of this lecture series and who's coming to talk. Your audience would be your fellow students. Perhaps you would want to extend that to be, professionals in the community who might be interested in this lecture series. And are you trying to get some kind of a desired reaction out of this poster? The desired reaction might be, I want to go to this lecture series because it looks really interesting. Right? So when you're thinking about a design project in general, you want to start thinking about what is this function, right? And I could very easily go off on a tangent and talk about architecturally. You can do the same thing. What is the purpose of this architectural design? What is the primary objective I'm trying to achieve with this design? Who is my audience? Who's going to be inhabiting that space? What is my desired reaction from that space? Those questions ring true for that as well. So the role of the designer. It's the designer's responsibility to create a strong communicative experience that supports the function of design, and these are the key things, the function of design on behalf of the client and for the viewer. So this is kind of interesting because generally speaking, you have this sort of a triangle that's working. You are the designer, you're trying to figure things out. You're working for somebody that's paying the bills, that would be your client, somebody who wants the poster in the first place. I guess in this context, your client would be me. because you're working for me to create this poster, and you're doing it not for the client. And I think that's a misnomer in the design sense. Sometimes you're doing it for the client, but a lot of times you're doing it for a third party. You're doing it for somebody who's viewing it. You're doing it for your fellow students to raise awareness, that sort of thing. So a lot of times that's separate, and it's important to kind of realize that. Some designer skills that would be worth cultivating. You're going to have to do a lot of analysis in this. You're going to have to perceive what's going on. Communication of ideas and thoughts is critical. Research, management, problem solving, right? Again, this kind of a list is something that we could brainstorm and come up with most of the items on this list. I think one thing that's really important to talk about, and I'll spend a lot of time today talking about this, is inspiration. And when you're kind of early in your design career, it's important to learn to kind of cultivate this and get it working within yourself so that you always feel inspired, you always feel like doing design work in the first place. And it takes a little bit of work to get used to how do you cultivate that, how do you make that stronger in yourself. At the same time, a seasoned veteran designer who's been doing it for 20, 30 years still needs inspiration, right? If you run out of inspiration, you just kind of run out of the motivation to do this line of work. And so this is definitely something you want to be aware of and want to cultivate. So how do you go about doing that? The first thing that I think is absolutely critical is to be hyper aware of your surroundings and what's going on, what's around you, what is interesting to you as you're walking around. And that's attentive. It means being awake and alert and what's going on. It means that you're observing things and being aware of what's happening, and you're very open-minded to new ideas and stuff that's going on. I think one of the best examples that I have about this comes from when I used to teach the construction class, which was a materials and methods of construction class. We talked about everything. We talked about concrete, wood, brick, whatever. And in the beginning of the class, I said, okay, all of you have experienced almost every material we're going to talk about in this class in some way or another. You've touched it, you've felt it, you've smelled it, you've seen it, right? But a lot of times your brain is just shut off to it, and you don't really think about that material in its larger context, right? You don't think about concrete. I wonder how they got that texture on the concrete. What was the formwork like? Did they board form it? Did they use form ties? There's all this background information that happens that's more than just the material, okay? And in the context of observation, in the context of inspiration, you need to train your eyes, you need to train yourself to be aware of everything that's going on. You need to be aware of what the weather is like, what the sun is like. What is it like when I got here this morning? What does it smell like? What does it feel like, right? How cold is the room when I walk into it, right? What's working about this room? What's not working about this room? All those things are part of how you train yourself to this perception. But in terms of inspiration, there are things around you that are interesting, right? I might walk across the courtyard and somebody posted a little poster that says, here's information about the ACE Club's putting together some kind of a lecture on here's the 3 design schools that most people go to from here, right? And so there's a little thing. And when I walk up to that, right, maybe it's in my design sense, maybe I kind of like it, maybe I kind of don't, but as I look at that, not only am I gaining, this is me as a designer, not only am I gaining the information about, oh, ACE Club is hosting this particular thing, but I'm also looking at the design, I'm looking at the font. Do I like the font? Do I think it should be a different font, right? All of that encompasses this sort of inspiration. It's something that I'm starting to collect and cultivate, right? So it's found in and transformed in tangible objects, and it's different for everyone, right? So if Salustya, you and I went somewhere and we experienced a lecture together, right, some kind of an architectural lecture, your perception of that would be entirely different than mine because we have different life experiences. And that is important to recognize. So just because I'm inspired by something, let's say we went to a Tom Main lecture, right? And I thought, oh my God, this lecture is fantastic. This guy is great. And you said, this guy's on crack. Like, I don't like it. I don't like anything he's saying. You would come away with a very different perception. You would come away with a very different inspiration than I did. But that's perfectly okay. That's part of being a designer. We all have things that we gravitate to and that we like and that sort of thing. So just because one thing is good for me doesn't mean it's good for you. But it's still the experience of it, and you have to put yourself out there to get that, right? Inspiration should never feel like a chore. It shouldn't feel like, oh my God, today I have to go out and I have to be inspired, right? There's something wrong if you're feeling that way. You should just be going along in life and be like, wow, that's really cool. You know, there was a sign that was up last semester that was about the lab hours, right? It had no bearing. It was like, when is the lab going to be open on Saturday, right? But whoever did it really graphically well, right? Had certain combination of text, the fonts were good, and it was kind of an inspiring little sign. And it was silly and stupid, and the fact that I'm inspired by the little hours that the lab is open is kind of irrelevant in the greater context of life, but it helped me kind of make sure that I was doing a good job with my design stuff as a whole. And so that kind of stuff is really important, and so you want to kind of cultivate that. It comes from a desire to create or to communicate ideas. You are all here in a design school for some reason, and my guess is you have an interest in this. Right? If you don't have an interest in this, maybe you should be thinking about a different career, right? But this is the kind of thing that should come naturally for it. The other thing is, don't forget to look inside. Do the things that you like to do, because that will help you be inspired with your own stuff, which is always useful, right? Collections are critical, right? If you think stuff is interesting, you think stuff is unique, what do you do with it? Right? The best thing to do is to try to collect it so you can flip back through it when you're feeling uninspired. When you don't have that inspiration, you can look back on, hey, this stuff was kind of cool, right? And so you can collect physical things, you can stick them in your sketchbook. One of the things that I think people often do with a sketchbook is they treat it as this precious object. They only draw in it. They're very careful with it, right? The best sketchbooks in the world are the ones that are full and stuffed and crammed with all kinds of stuff in them. Right? That are your ideas, they're other people's ideas, you glue them together, you tape it in, right? That's the best kind of sketchbook. It's not a precious object. It's something that you're actively really using, and that's really critical, right? So you write notes, you make drawings. Don't forget, you all have cell phones now that take good pictures. Take pictures of stuff, right? If you think something's really interesting, take a picture of it, right? That helps you cultivate this, and then you look back on it. You know, you have an app like Time Hop, and then all of a sudden it pops up a year later, and you're like, wow, I really am still inspired by that. That's a cool idea, right? And so I'm showing you a variety of these random objects that I think are kind of interesting, right? And you develop this kind of appreciation for objects. It's like, why do people like Apple products so much? There's a certain design sense that people really appreciate, especially in the design realm, right? And you know, I'm going to go off on a tangent, but you can deal with me. So you guys all know the iPhone 6 came out and the 6 Plus, right? I think, and I had this long conversation with a good friend of mine about this. I think this is the first time that you're really seeing a company like Apple proving to be a corporate company that's trying to produce products that people will buy. Where before you had Steve Jobs at the helm, and Steve Jobs would say, no, you're doing it this way because this is the right design decision, not because it's the cheapest way to do it. And so, for example, in the iPhone 6, and just bear with me on these side tangent stories, but I think they're relevant peripherally to what we're talking about. Okay, so you see the iPhone 6. The camera sticks out a little bit, right, on the back side if you've seen it, right? That is not something that Steve Jobs would have ever let happen, right? Ever. There's no way. He would have said, bullshit, make it smaller, right? That's his reaction to this sort of thing. And because he had this design sense, he would have never let a company do it. But he had enough power in a company with enough design sense to actually be able to make that stick, right? Now, Apple's run by a much bigger, not that the Tim Cook and everybody isn't really good. Johnny Ives is still there, right? That sort of thing. But it's running like a company. It's running to make money, right? They produce a new phone. They sell 4 million in the first day. They did pretty well, right? But it's not about the design. So you really need to have somebody who has a stake in something like this that's going to push that design forward, right? Much harder in an economic position that can do it. And so you as a designer have this challenge, right? You have clients who are going to say, I don't want to pay for it. I don't want to pay to make the camera smaller, right? I don't want to make it fit in that thinner bezel. You as the designer have to insist that that's the right move, right? And you have to push that agenda forward. And that's really critical as a designer, and you will run into that challenge a lot. So sorry for the side story, but I think it's a really relevant one to showing what a designer can do in this context. How do you nurture your inspiration, right? You carry a notebook with you wherever you go. Right? You carry your phone with you. Maybe you draw in your phone. I mean, smartphones are kind of taking the place of sketchbooks in this weird way, right? But it's still there. You become immersed in design. And that's kind of a critical idea. If you're in this field, you want people that like this stuff around you. You want to be able to have a dialogue about these kinds of design ideas with the people that are around you. Because if you don't, if you live in an isolated environment, you will go stale, right? You need that. Part of the reason I love teaching, part of the reason I love being here is because I interact with all of you, right? And you guys make me inspired. You give me fresh ideas. You make me rethink things. And that's really important, right? For my design philosophy, context, and that sort of thing. You need to commit to discovering and collecting your inspirational factors, whatever those are. You need to communicate with your other designers. You have to be able to verbalize what you're talking about, which is kind of critical to this. If you get stuck, however, there are other things that you can do, like taking a walk or listening to music, and you probably do these naturally anyway. You might explore others' areas of interest. Architects are known to love cooking. I have no idea why, but for some reason we all love to cook. And if you don't love to cook, it doesn't mean you're going to be a bad architect. I'm just saying there's this weird association with cooking and architecture. And so, like, when I was in grad school, we'd all have dinners together because we like to cook so much, right? And it was kind of this weird, irrelevant thing, but you find these common interests. So maybe if you're interested in cooking, right, that helps inspire you for other things. For me, I have this backside interest in websites and web design and all that sort of thing. So I do a lot of that on my free time just to help cultivate the architectural interest. So these things fold back on themselves, right? The other thing that's great is if there are lecture series or events or things that ACE Club's hosting or that sort of thing. Those are so valuable to your experience as a designer because you're becoming aware and you're interacting with other people that are really good in their field, right? And this is particularly relevant for lecture series. Whether it's here, we bring in a really good crew of lecturers. At the same time, if you went to Berkeley and saw their lecture series, they're pulling from a different crowd of people. But these people that are coming in to talk are kind of the top of their game in their field, and it's really important to get their impressions. What are they doing? Because that will help you grow too, right? Obviously, if you're really stuck, just try something new. It's amazing what that'll do, okay? Inspiration is always the first step toward the final design, and that's critical to understand. I think this one's really funny. I have never read this book, but I want to read it. It's just, I don't know, it's very true. Anyway, the design process, okay? So it involves research followed by information gathering. Then you're going to do some brainstorming, conceptualizing what's happening, right? You're going to experiment a ton. That's a big part of the design process. You're going to develop those experiments into something real, right? And then you're going to execute it into something. So let's break those down a little bit, right? You cannot skip steps in the design process. It won't work. You can never go from your initial idea to the finished architectural product in one leap. It's never going to happen, right? And if you try to do that in studio, and some of you have been in 121, some of you are in 220. If you ever make that jump, whoever's involved in your studio, whoever's the head of your studio will say, well, did you think about this and this and this and this and this? And you go, oh no, right? I got to go back and rethink everything. And that's normal, right? Design is always an evolution. It's always one layer upon the next layer upon the next layer upon the next layer, right? And every step must have your full attention, right? Basically, you can't half-ass a step. It doesn't work, right? You need to be able to give it your full attention and really work on it. That means when you're taking a shower, you're thinking about your design process. It means when you're driving home, you're thinking about your design. It means when you're eating dinner, you're thinking about your design. You live and breathe that, and that's critical. That's also really why grad school is really hard, because you really do it 24 hours a day because you stop sleeping. Anyway, it's hard, but it's remarkably rewarding, and you get these great things out of it, and I think that's something that's really critical. So when we start, right, each project, whether it's in graphic design or whether it's in architectural design, right, or industrial design or whatever, it always starts with some kind of a project brief. And you guys in a design studio are going to get a piece of paper that says, this is the project. We're designing a multifamily home, and these are the people that are going to be living there, and that blah, 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 blah. This is how many square feet it should be. That is, in essence, a project brief. Right? It's a meticulous overview of the project. Okay? It addresses the design detail in every aspect of the problem. Right? It defines the roles of you as the designer. What are you responsible for? What's the client responsible for? What's the viewer responsible for? Right? Usually the viewer is just to view it. Right? You're going to begin with the information that's given to you by a client in the project brief. chances are that information is going to be too brief, right? It's not going to be enough. And you're going to have to clarify and simplify that information and gather more information such that you can actually use it, right? And a lot of times it takes some going back. You want me to design a poster, you say, wait a minute, what architects am I doing, right? It's the next logical question. You want to keep building on that information until you feel like you have a good picture of what it is that you're going to be doing, right? You, as the designer, are responsible for asking the right questions, right, to clarify or fill in any blanks that are out there, right? So let's say you were starting a project, you were doing a website for somebody, you really want to know all that they want. What do they want out of this website, right? What do they want? What is the desired client? You got to ask all these sorts of questions, right? You also want to define the primary goals and the messages to be expressed, right? What are you trying to get out of this in the first place, right? What are any restrictions that are on the project? And these can usually be monetary. That's usually the first one. This is my budget, can't exceed this. But it could be other things like I can't use the color red for some reason, or there can be other things that are part of this process. You usually want to define some kind of a timetable for completion, and you usually want to define an audience. I will spend a brief minute talking about timetable for completion. Architects, designers are notorious for not budgeting their time well. They're probably the worst. We're great in a lot of things, but in terms of budgeting and planning our time, we're horrible, right? Learn quickly and early how long it takes you to do things, and start to budget that timing in. When I was in grad school, which is a great example of all of us living together, big group of people, everybody has different skill sets, everybody knows how long it takes them to build certain things, how long it takes them to do certain things. All too often, people underestimate how long it's going to take to build that model, how long it's going to take to do that drawing, right? You got to be honest with yourself, you got to know how long this stuff takes, because if you don't plan accordingly, you're going to stay up all night before and never finish. Right? And this is a notorious problem in the world of architecture. We all do it, right? Budget your time, learn to budget your time, right? And that's where this define the timetable is important. Then you start gathering, right? You're collecting any textual or visual information together. If anything is missing, and this is critical, you have to either get it from the client or figure out who's going to provide it, right? Who's going to write it? And this is one of the hard things about web design. I had a side project, this is several years ago, where I had somebody asked me to do a website. They were running for a school board position. And they were, it was a public election, or it was like a superintendent position or something. Anyway, it's a public election, and they were running this campaign, and they needed a website, and they needed to kind of organize, information about themselves, their philosophies, and all this stuff. And I said, hey, I'm happy to do it. I have a host. I'll set it up. I'll get it going, right? Well, great. I set it up. But then it got to be time to, okay, here's the biographical information. Here's all this stuff about her. And in this context, it was like, well, wait a minute. Where is all this information? Like, I have the whole. I have the space for it. This is where your biography goes. But I don't really know you well enough to write the whole biography. So, like, where's it going to come from? Right? And we got to this point where it's like, look, I need all this information. She's like, well, I don't have time to provide it for you. And it's like, well, then the website's going to suck because I don't have the information. So when you're doing this sort of information gathering phase, you really need to make sure you get everything. If it's going to have a biography, you need to make sure you get that biography, right? If it's going to have information about, classes or whatever it is, the lecture series, what is the lecture series, who's coming, what times are they going to be, and that sort of thing. For your lecture series poster, I'm giving you a lot of freedom in that so that you don't feel restricted into, I have to do this particular lecture series and it's got to say this. You can make up any times of the day, you can make up any days, you can make up any architects, it's fine, but you're responsible for actually building that information. Okay? Then you move into the research phase, and this is where you have to gain an understanding of the particular topic. And I think this is one of the coolest things in the design world that we get to do that other fields don't get to do, right? If we're doing something, whether it's a graphic design piece or whether it's an architectural design piece, we have to become an expert in whatever that subject is so that we can be competent in producing the design for that. So let's say you're hired to design a zoo, right? You've been hired to design a zoo. Well, guess what? You better go become an expert in, zoo so that you can actually do a good design for it. You need to understand, what are all the animals? How much space do they need? What's the traffic flow? How do people move through the space? You need to completely live zoo so that you can design for that, right? Then, a year later, you're hired to do a library. You have to do the same thing for a library. You have to understand every little minute detail about how a library works, how the books are stored, how tall a shelf has to be, all that information, right? And then you move on, and the next project you do is something else, right? And so you get this opportunity in this field to really explore and learn so much about other fields. And that's one of the unique things about being a designer is you get to play around with all this stuff, and you become very worldly knowledgeable about stuff because you have to be. And that's one of the coolest things about being a designer, right? You need to independently research any additional information. You need to review, what current stuff is out there that the client's been doing. What style do they already kind of like so that you can be within that realm. And you also want to investigate competitive markets. Who else is doing what you're trying to do here? Right? What other companies are doing this? What other schools are doing this? So for example, in the lecture series, good thing to start with would be what other schools are doing lecture series? What do their posters look like? Right? It's good background research. It's good background information can help you decide what to do. Then you move on to brainstorming. And this is kind of a personal process in terms of what works well for you. You can do free writing lists, you can do mind maps, you can do all these brainstorming techniques. Often it just involves sketching out a bunch of ideas in your sketchbook. Little things that are you think are relevant and kind of playing around with those. That's usually what's involved for us as designers. Then you move into the conceptualization stage, right? This is where you're kind of formulating a plan for the project. What's it going to look like? What am I kind of general overarching theme is this going to be, right? It's the thematic link between the design, the function, and the final delivery of whatever this is, right? Then you move into the experimentation phase, which is totally the fun part, right? Where you just start messing with stuff, you start playing around with it, you start coming up with ideas, you start throwing out things, and this is one of the coolest ways of doing it. And one of the things that you'll find really good designers will create multiple versions of things and start to pick through. And as you develop those different treatments, you change the colors, you change the fonts, you change these things, right? You start to sort out, oh, that one's not good, that one's not good, that one's not good. And you start to collect, this is good, this is good. And then you start to compare the ones that are good and you start to build upon that. Same thing happens in architectural design where you start throwing out ideas, what fits, what doesn't, and you snowball that into what the final project is going to be, right? Then you move to the final execution, right? That's where you're distilling down the very best ideas and really polishing those ideas, examining it in detail. The best architects in the world can understand the building as a whole, but can completely understand how one little corner of the building meets the foundation, right? At the 1 inch by 1 inch level. Right? Those are the very best architects, the ones that can do the big scale all the way down to the small scale and keep it all in their heads. Right? Same thing happens in graphic design. Overarching big picture, small details. You want to make sure all of that is cohesive, and that's really important. You also, and this is really critical to learn early, and it's really hard, is that you have to detach yourself from this work. All too often, you have somebody in studio, especially early in their architectural career, they invest their heart and their soul in a project, and they get to the final review of that project, and the reviewers come in and just blast them. Right? You didn't think about this, you didn't think about this, what if you turn this upside down, what if, and you feel like, oh my God, I failed. Right? The hardest part, and especially in that instance, is you start to defend yourself. You start to get, angry, those kinds of things. Anybody ever felt this sort of thing in a review process? I have, right? I know this happens, right? The biggest thing to realize, though, is that when you're in this process and you're getting to a final review phase like that, it's no longer about you. This is my baby. This is my work. It's about, here's my work, can you teach me how to make this better, right? So if you detach yourself from the work, if you take a step back, look at it as if it was somebody else's work, right? Look at it as if it was Ralph's work, right? Those kinds of things, if you can do that, if you can separate yourself out from it, that's where the learning really begins, right? If you can look at it objectively, and it takes a long time to train yourself to do that, right? you're in your master's thesis and the reviewers start to tell you stuff and you're trying to like argue with them and whatever. It's just natural. You spent a semester working on this project. You spent a year working on this project, right? But at the same time, you have to detach yourself. You have to let it go, and you have to really understand what they're trying to say, because they are trying to make you better, right? Generally, after that, you want to review the project brief and understand whether you achieved what you set out to, right? That's always important. And then you're going to finally produce that final draft of the product, right? The last thing that we'll talk about is something called intuition. And this is very hard to explain. It's even harder to teach, right? But it's something that you will have to have as you go forward in your architectural career, your design career. You can learn the fundamentals. You can learn technically how to do things. But at a certain point, you have to trust this thing called your intuition. And no matter how much you understand the techniques, if you don't have good intuition, it won't all click together. The good news is you can have good intuition. You just have to learn to listen to it. And so intuition is this thing. It's kind of a different level of thinking. It's what happens in the background, and it's specifically meant to complement your rational thought process, the logical, laid out thought process. It comes naturally. You can't force it. It allows your thoughts, right, to come out, basically. The idea behind this sort of intuition, and you've probably had this happen interacting with somebody like me or a studio head or something like that, where we will say something like, "It just doesn't feel right?" Or that's not right, And it's hard even from a critiquing standpoint to pinpoint what's wrong about it. That little thing is that intuition. Or if something feels really good, like, God, I nailed this. Right? That's that intuition saying, yes, this is right. I'm doing the right thing. And you have to learn to listen to that voice about what's working and what's not working. So this is designed to provide you guidance. It's designed ultimately to provide you some protection too, because this will tell you, this is really not working out, or this is working out. It's for your enlightenment. It's for your synthesis of thoughts, right? It's going to always cultivate your imagination. It's that stuff that happens in the backgrounds, the what ifs, right? It allows you to move beyond your comfort zone. And this is great for you to think about, but the truth is right now in your career, you're always going to be moving out of your comfort zone. We're always going to be pushing you like that. When you get further down the road as a designer and you start, let's say you become an architect, your expertise is single-family housing, you start doing single-family house after single-family house, you start to get kind of in a rut. Right? And you don't branch out, you don't try to do something new. That's where this intuition can come into play. You can feel like it's okay for you to try something new because you can trust your intuition as to whether it's right or wrong, and you're not going to be embarrassed by it. Right? It's going to lead to the fresh and innovative solutions. Right? It's the out of the box perspective. It's what's not expected. That's where this is going to come from. Right? It's going to always increase the number of ideas that are going to be generated, and it's often going to provide that spark. When you feel like you're stuck in the design, and then all of a sudden you get that little spark that says, yes, this is how I'm going, that's coming from this intuition. Right? You have to learn to allow your intuition to surface. It's so easy for your rational mind to suppress your intuition and say, no, I know you don't think, intuition, that this is the right thing to do, but I've already laid out the steps, and this is what I need to do. Right? So you stop listening to it, and that's where stuff goes wrong, right? The other thing is, if you fully trust your intuition and you just go for it, right, you have to suppress this worry or this fear that you're going to fail, right? The best designers in the world are the ones that just leap off the cliff, and they say, I'm going to do it, right? Those are the best designers because they're willing to take that risk, because they're willing to trust their intuition. Right? That's where the best designer is going to be. The ones that stay in your comfort zone and don't take those risks are never going to be as good as the people who say, I'm all for it and I'm all in. Right? And this is hard to do in an academic environment. If you're in a studio, right, and I've had this happen in some of my studios, you get to a point where it's like, I can do the safe choice. I can do it. I know I can get it done. I know it's going to work out and it's going to be a reasonable building. Or I can leap off the cliff and do this chance, and it might affect my grade. And I don't know whether it's the right decision. I don't know. But my gut is saying this is what I need to do. That's where that succession, that's where that project will either dramatically succeed or it'll dramatically fail, right? And you have to be willing to let it go and do it. And that's part of being a designer, is to be able to leap off that cliff and have the faith in your intuition that it's going to work out. And it takes guts to do that sort of thing, right? The other thing is you can't prejudge or abandon. You can't. Your intuition is saying do this. You can't say, oh, that's dumb. Stop doing that. I'm going to do it this way. You have to let it kind of come to the surface because it might be the right decision, and you have to let that happen, right? Of course, all that being said, it's not always useful or appropriate, so there are times where you have to say, no, as much as I want to make this bright pink and fuzzy, it's not the right thing, okay? You want to try to nurture that intuition. You don't want to be afraid to take risks. You want to say yes, trust it, right? Listen to that inner voice, react to it, whether that's for it or against it, right? Expect the unexpected to come out. Don't overanalyze or microanalyze what's coming out. Just try to let some stuff flow out of you, right? You, in this field, are inherently creative. I know all of you are creative. You wouldn't be here if you weren't. So let that flow out of you. That's really important, right? Record your thoughts, collect visuals. That will help you as well, all right? So elevate yourselves, okay? So that's kind of the graphic design one, kind of talking about general design concepts, which I think is critical at this stage of the game. Let me stop this.